Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We're going to go from science to rock and roll, and we're going to start out with Heinrich Rohrer, who was a physicist who won the 1986 Nobel Prize in Physics with his partner Gerd Binning for his development of the scanning tunneling microscope. Dr. Rohrer died recently at the age of 79. He was born in Switzerland, and he worked in the Swiss laboratory of IBM. He had a good understanding of quantum mechanics, and he and Dr. Binning worked with superconductivity and electron microscopes when they developed the scanning tunneling microscope, which allowed them to image and manipulate individual atoms. Here's an interview with Dr. Rohrer where he explains the concept of the scanning tunneling microscope.
You were awarded the 1986 Nobel Prize in Physics together with Ernst Ruska and Gerd Binning for your joint work in developing microscopy. And in particular, you and Gerd Binning received the prize for your design of the scanning tunneling microscope. This is a device that enables us to look at the surface of objects at the atomic scale by means of a probe which skims over the surface and records variations in the topography below it with minute current fluctuations. What did this device enable us to see for the first time that we hadn't seen before?
Surface structures in a different way. I mean, you had some ideas about certain surface structures, but you never saw it in, so to speak, in real space. It's just like if you would trace a surface with your finger. So you see it in real space, and then of course, actually you see the electrons on the surface. It's the electronic wave functions. And so you also can see certain properties. You can test the hardness of a surface. Yeah. But then of course, in the same way, you also can take atoms. The principle is the same as if you take your fingers and you play around with small balls. And the fingers, if you take nano fingers, the small balls can be atoms. And it's exactly the same thing. You can take an atom, you can put it somewhere else, or you can take your fingers and glide over the surface and feel the surface, feel the bumps and so on. So with the same fingers, you can do two jobs. You can change it, or you can feel it,
you can detect it, or you can move it around, you can play with it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I think the first surprise was that we really could do it with atomic resolution, you see. Actually, that you can do it with atomic resolution, that's inherent in the approach we took. But we didn't expect it that we could make such fine fingers. But then every point of a needle ends up with one atom. And this very atom at the end, that's then your finger, you see. And this atom has the size of an atom, yes. And so you can feel other atoms. And that was a pleasant surprise that you could do it relatively easy. We didn't see any obstacle which could not be overcome. Of course, there were quite a few fortuitous developments in the whole thing, but somehow luck was on our side. But I think you always, in science, you need luck. And if you don't have the luck in a specific case, then you do something different. You might have luck in something else. You see, it was less difficult, finally, than everybody thought. And that's why everybody thought you could not do it. And that's why nobody did it. That's, I would say, a crucial thing in science. You see, everything is new because other people think you cannot do it, or because other people do not appreciate that it could become important. And we live off novelty in science. So whenever you do something new, you have to overcome certain beliefs that it cannot be done, that it is not interesting, and so on.
A number of scientists have called quantum mechanics the most important development of the 20th century because it led to so many other things like revolutions in computer chips and information technology. The work of Dr. Rohrer was very important in developing the science of nanotechnology, which has the potential to revolutionize things like electronics, chemistry, and medicine by dealing with individual atoms and superconductivity. As one of his colleagues said, Dr. Rohrer was the man who taught us that atoms can be moved and manipulated like Lego pieces. We're going to move on now to Joe Farman, who died recently at the age of 83. And Joe Farman was a British scientist, a CBE. Joe Farman was one of the people credited with discovering the hole in the ozone layer in the Antarctic. We talked about the hole in the ozone layer in the Antarctic last year when we did the podcast on Sherwood Rowland. I urge you to look that up. Sherwood Rowland was one of the people who discovered that chlorofluorocarbons, also known as CFCs, were responsible for depleting the ozone. When Joe Farman discovered the hole in the ozone layer in the Antarctic, it led to the Montreal Protocol, which banned the use of CFCs and started to restore the ozone layer. Here's a report on Joe Farman from the BBC4's Last Word with Matthew Bannister.
I'm Joe Farman, and my team is usually credited with having found the Antarctic ozone hole back in 1985.
Joe Farman was a research scientist with the British Antarctic Survey. His discovery of a hole in the ozone layer which protects life on Earth from the damaging effects of solar rays forced politicians to act. The problem was being caused by chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were commonly found in aerosol sprays. John Shanklin was part of Joe's three-man research team.
Joe was very much like one of those old-fashioned movie scientists from the wartime period. A stickler for detail. There were sort of two particular aspects that I remember of Joe. One was his pipe. Joe was an inveterate pipe smoker. The more the fumes came out, the harder he was thinking. And obviously with the discovery of the ozone hole, there were a lot of fumes coming out of his pipe.
The British Antarctic Survey set up stations, so we'd been monitoring very many things in Antarctica for a long while. And suddenly in 1985, it dawned on us that we were sitting on top of one of the biggest environmental discoveries of the decade, I suppose, or perhaps even of the century.
The other thing I remember was quite often when you went past his office, he seemed to be asleep. But he wasn't. As with many scientists, he could think better with his eyes closed than with his eyes open. All of that together, I think, went into the discovery of the ozone hole.
We saw this sort of little dip appearing, and then it just accelerated so rapidly that within 3 or 4 years we were talking about 30% change in the thickness of ozone above us, which is an enormous amount. And if we can be slightly proud of the fact, this was really the first time that anyone had shown that ozone levels had changed since the measurements began, way back in 1926 or thereabouts, when Dobson made his original pioneering measurements.
And that caused Joe really to start puffing on his pipe.
Joe and the team went to the British Halley base in Antarctica to investigate further. On the line from the base, its current commander, Agnieszka Frykowska, describes the conditions Joe faced.
For Joe, there would have been a lot of hard outdoor work as well, cutting up snow to melt down for drinking water, washing water. There would have been a lot of work with the team to bake bread, to clean the station, and other things like that.
I believe he had a 25-year-old Dobson meter, which was a kind of rudimentary ozone measuring machine, which only worked when swathed in a duvet.
Well, yes, because I think back then they would have had to take it outside on a trolley to be able to take the measurements of the ozone, because you need good access. You need to basically see the sky. We're quite lucky now, particularly in our new station. We've got a lovely top layer floor, the upper obs area, where the Dobson now sits, and there's just a hole in the ceiling that gets opened up, and it looks directly up into the sky from that, and we're inside nice and warm. So, yeah, a little different.
We thought it was very clear from the first that the reason for the decline was the chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. That clearly put the blame on us for putting them there in the first place. And he was a very active behind the scenes, I think, campaigner for getting something done. And of course, something was done. The Montreal Protocol and all its extensions was drawn up. Today, every single one of the UN member states has signed the basic protocol, and more importantly, it's working. Largely, that effort is due to Joe.
The Montreal Protocol has been a big success. We've certainly succeeded in stopping the increase in the chlorine, and it's now just turning over gently. But you have to remember one rather horrifying fact, and that is that we've got global change going on. We've got the Earth getting warmer at the bottom, we've got the stratosphere cooling at the top, and it's almost impossible to predict what the future is.
How is his work viewed by the scientists still working at the base now?
They just appreciate how significant it is that we've got such a long-term record. They fully appreciate how significant the findings were and are motivated to keep it going.
Well, we're going to move on from science to rock and roll, and we're going to open our feature subject tonight with a little classical music. Here's a little bit of Bach's Minuet in G. Thanks to Ray Manzarek, who died recently at the age of 72, that was turned into one of the most famous openings in rock and roll music.
We were rehearsing and we had a beach house on Venice Beach. You stepped out the door onto sand. Robby comes in with Light My Fire. But we got to have an introduction. I said, guys, walk out the door and go to the beach and walk out to the ocean 30 yards away, turn around and come back, and I'll see if I can have something by the time you come back. They step out the door, and Johann Sebastian Bach comes and possesses my fingers and says, all right, Ray, you will go, remember the little Bach things you have played? You will now go to the G to the D, da 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 da. And I went to the door and said, come on, I've got it, man. And the guys all came back in. Bam, we were right on it.
That, of course, is Light My Fire. Ray Manzarek was the keyboard player for the Doors. He worked with drummer John Densmore, guitarist Robby Krieger, and, of course, the Lizard King, Jim Morrison. Ray was a nice Polish Catholic boy born on the south side of Chicago. He went to St. Rita High and then on to DePaul. When he was a young man, his parents did what all the Polish Catholic parents did back then. They gave him piano lessons, hoping he'd be the next Chopin or at least the next Liberace. After college, he moved out to LA where he was supposed to study law, but he started studying film instead. One day on Venice Beach, he met Jim Morrison. They decided to start a band, got the two other guys, and they decided to call themselves The Doors. They had a couple songs before, but Light My Fire was their iconic song, and Ray Manzarek's keyboard playing was a huge part of it. Yeah, Ray lost his religion there on Venice Beach, but that Bach was still screaming to get out. Here's a BBC interview with a former editor of Rolling Stone on Ray Manzarek.
Well, Ben Fong Torres is the former editor of Rolling Stone magazine, also wrote the book The Doors by the Doors, and you were a friend of Ray Manzarek, weren't you, Ben?
Good morning. Yes.
It's a sad day for you and a sad day for so many people. This was a man producing the signature sound in one of the great rock and roll bands, which isn't a bad thing to say about your life, is it?
Not at all, especially for a guy who, along with Robby and John, were kind of in the shadows of Jim Morrison for most of the career of the Doors. Ray proved himself to be a stellar musician and is getting some recognition.
The Doors were a band that didn't need a bass player because Ray Manzarek produced it with the keyboard.
As he said, the bass was lefty, his left hand, and he played a small bass instrument on top of his keyboards.
How do you describe the sound that the Doors produced? Because I remember when I was a kid, it's a kind of haunting sound, isn't it? And when you were, as a child, getting into slightly more credible music, I can almost remember the time that I heard the Doors. You heard them and you thought, well, this is something pretty different. It's a deep sound, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's not unlike the Stones in many ways, in that it was an amalgam of all kinds of musical influences on a foundation of blues and jazz. And I think some of the best bands were those that were able to, with some talent and skill, pick from a lot of different influences, ranging from Latin and folk to jazz and a pop even, on a foundation of rock and blues.
Yeah.
And there you had pretty much the Doors sound. All it was not was categorizable. It wasn't acid rock.
Rolling Stone, ever a little pretentious. I think an amalgam is an amalgam. But Ray Manzarek was an invaluable part of the Doors, and his sound was distinct. Let's listen to a couple of his keyboard riffs. Here he is on Break On Through.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day.
Here he is on Alabama Song. This is Kurt Weill, German Weimar decadence brought to LA and Jim Morrison decadence.
Well, show me the way to the next whiskey bar. I tell you we must die. Oh, moon, ba, 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 ba.
haunting, I'll give you Riders on the Storm.
Riders on the storm.
Here's another one less known, but another one of my favorites, 20th Century Fox.
She's a 20th century fox. She's a 20th century fox. No pills, no films, no years, no clocks. She's a 20th century fox.
And what are the Doors without a little LA Woman? Manzarek was sort of the unofficial spokesman of the Doors, especially after Morrison died, and here he tells about their first and only appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Some representative from network television came into our dressing room half hour before showtime, and we looked at him and he said, "Boys," and we hated being called boys, "we've got a problem." And we all looked at each other and said, "Oh man, now what?" You cannot, on network television, say the word higher.
Now the Doors, here they are with their newest hit record.
And I jumped up and said, okay, fine, we'll think of something. Don't worry, there's no problem. He left the room, we all looked at each other and said, what are we going to do? Jim said, I'm not going to change the lyric. And I said, let's not change the lyric. Whoever it was from network came backstage afterwards and started to scream at us. But you promised you wouldn't say higher. And then I went into my routine. Well, look, sir, we were just so excited. It's the Ed Sullivan Show. We're just kids. We're so nervous. We didn't know what we were doing. We've done it this way 1,000 times. And we're sorry we said the word higher. And he said, well, you promised you'll never work the Ed Sullivan Show ever again. Then he lays this bomb on us. We were going to book you for 6 more performances, and you'll never work the Ed Sullivan Show again. And we looked at each other and went, whoops, we could have done 6 more Ed Sullivan shows. And then Morrison, in classic Jim Morrison fashion, looked at the guy and said, hey, man, we just did the Ed Sullivan Show.
Manzarek had a good sense of humor. A couple years ago, he played keyboard for Weird Al on his parody of the Doors' Craigslist.
Wow, yeah! Come on, let's find that love connection that we miss. On Craigslist! Yeah, Craigslist! Come on!
Dead on Jim Morrison, huh? Weird Al Yankovic, a funny guy. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And we close with Alan O'Day, who died at the age of 72, was a minor rock and roller who had a #1 hit in 1977 with this song.
Undercover Angel, midnight fantasy. I never had a dream that made sweet love to me. Undercover Angel, answer to my prayer. You made me know that there's a love for me out there somewhere.
Well, we can't close on that direct, but Alan O'Day did have a connection to the Doors. He wrote this lyric, sung by Bobby Hatfield of the Righteous Brothers.
Sing a song to light my fire. Remember Jim that way.
Alan O'Day wrote it, and now he, Bobby Hatfield, Ray Manzarek, and Jim Morrison are now reunited in rock and roll heaven.